Transformation Ground Control. Your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
This is the podcast about everything related to digital transformation, including strategy, people, process, technology, etc. And you can find new episodes every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all the audio podcast platforms that you might listen to podcasts on. We have an exciting show for you today. We're going to start off the show with some hot topics. We'll talk about how to measure project KPIs, or what some of the best project KPIs are to measure the performance of your digital transformation. We'll talk about some investments in manufacturing throughout the world that big pharma is making in Germany and other parts of the world. We'll talk about how workplace tech is difficult compared to personal technology, and we'll also get into the hybrid workplace and how technology in this hybrid work environment that many of us are in really is being driven by, or the technology is driving the employee experience. So we'll talk about those and other hot topics here to open up the segment. And then later in the show, our first guest is going to be Christina Serrano, who's actually Dr. Christina Serrano. She is a professor of MIS or IT at Colorado State University. And we're going to have her on the show to talk about the psychology of digital transformation and really get inside the heads and the psychoanalysis of understanding what makes people tick and how digital transformation affects people and vice versa. That'll be a really interesting conversation. And then finally, last but not least, we will have Scott Janke from Third Stage Consulting on the show to talk about a case study of organizational alignment during implementation for a mid-size, we'll call it a semi-manufacturing company based in North America. So we'll do a little case study to talk about the organizational alignment and implementation side of things. So before we get to that, though, Kyler, what are some of these hot topics that you have for us today?
Yeah, definitely. So we talk a lot about just measuring the business value of a digital transformation. And I wanted to get your feedback on some research I had done just regarding KPIs. We all know that any project, you set key performance metrics in order to understand the success of the project. But this specific research showed the importance of extended KPIs, or KPIs that continued after the project was already complete. And I wondered if you could give us maybe an example or just your overall feedback, if that is kind of a key to determining the success of any technology implementation or digital transformation project.
It is, yeah. I think that's two layers of what you're asking. I mean, first of all, you want to know what your definitions of success are, and have a clear vision for what it is you expect to get out of the project. And the second part of that is it really changes or shifts the thinking from let's just implement on time and on budget, which is important. But beyond that, what else is important? I mean, in terms of business value, we want to get out of the transformation and that sort of thing. So I think it's a very relevant conversation and something that not enough organizations think about when they go through a digital transformation.
Absolutely. And what about things that aren't exactly hard data to start with on the forefront of an implementation or any sort of technology upgrade, say maybe the people side of the component? I would assume, and again, big assumption, that that's more of a long-term data point than a short-term. We have things like user adoption, but just the overall relationship between the employee or workforce and the technology. Is that something that would be considered kind of a post-implementation key performance metric to take into consideration in the long term?
Yeah, it can and should be. I mean, if you think of your investments in technology as a long-term investment that you're trying to maximize value of or over the long term, then you want to be measuring the results over time. And it may be that your results ebb and flow. You start off strong or you start off weak, and it changes and evolves. And as your business changes and as the technology changes, there's a high likelihood you're going to get misalignment between your operational needs and your technology. So it's really important to make sure that you nip that in the bud by measuring these longer term KPIs and really tracking where you're at and how you can be improving and maximizing that value over time.
Absolutely. And speaking of KPIs, we talk a lot about industry specific in our hot topics when it comes to emerging technologies or understanding business goals. And Bayer, which is a big pharma company, has recently, as you kind of teased in our headlines today, invested, it's actually 1.4 billion euros, which is about 1.55 billion US dollars, in new production sites in Berlin. And the reason for this large investment is because they are moving towards a completely smart and innovative manufacturing shop floor and facilities. So, some of the things that they're investing in is artificial intelligence, data science, and then I thought this one was pretty interesting, multi-channel marketing. And for me, someone who's in marketing, I get real excited when we actually get to be included in the, emerging technologies and just the overall data science behind marketing. So I wanted to get your reaction to actually rolling in all of your systems, processes, and then also promotion into considering a digital transformation.
Yeah. So, what's the question then, as far as what about rolling in the
Yeah, we don't typically see a company say, "Hey, I'm going to go make a whole smart shop floor." Usually, it stops there, right? We're going to look at things like data science, but they're talking about they're actually going to roll in their marketing to their digital transformation too. So maybe that holistic view is something we talk about across enterprise, making sure that all technologies are going through the business transformation, not just one. So I wanted to hear kind of your reaction to that, being on more of the systems side than the marketing side.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's marketing or any other part of your business, I think it's really important to recognize that a digital transformation should look at your end-to-end business processes and identify areas that can be improved, regardless of what area they might be in. So rather than just focusing on manufacturing or just on procurement or financials or whatever the case may be, it's really looking more broadly at the entire operations. I think it's also a good indicator of where a lot of organizations are headed with sort of that vertical integration of trying to pull together more data and more visibility, beginning with the customer and even the prospective customers, and understanding what their needs are and projecting demand and trying to anticipate that demand that would then flow into your manufacturing and your planning and all that stuff. So I think it really what you're mentioning here, it really plays into the those two overall trends.
Absolutely. And from the marketing side of the house, it is a data-driven science as well. It can come with a lot of creative approaches, but we talk about that a lot with even Christina today, talking about kind of novice versus expert and how there is kind of room for that big picture thinking, even if it's not on the technical side. But this innovation, they actually call it the Digital Innovation Center in Germany that Bayer's opening. I think it's a good lens into kind of that future of manufacturing. But like we've talked about before in the show, they're actually building it from scratch as opposed to trying to take an existing manufacturing location and put all of these emerging technologies inside of it. And it just goes along with what we talked about a few weeks ago, that that's much easier said than done in an existing. It's almost similar to how I see it, the kind of the cloud migration approach, whether it's lift and shift or build from scratch. You can kind of take that same methodology and think about building a smart manufacturing floor that a lot of times we've seen with Amazon or some of our bigger manufacturing partners that we cover here, that it is actually easier to just completely build it from scratch.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that is a good way to look at it. I mean, you kind of, I guess it really opens up the different options you have. When you're looking at building from scratch versus not. There's a lot of different ways you can approach that, and I think just having a clear vision and a clear alignment around what it is you're trying to accomplish, I think that's the important thing there.
Absolutely. And you learn so much from these kind of smart manufacturing pieces. Obviously, we know a lot about just manufacturing operations in general, but you think about everything, you really have to dive into each detail. For example, if you have a robot fulfilling a certain piece of the overall order, how close is that robot to the raw materials, because they can't move in the same way that a human person could. So, you just considering all of those different things is just so fascinating to me when we talk about smart manufacturing. I certainly think it's the future, but like a lot of things that we talk about specifically right now in our current climate of technology, it's an evolution as opposed to, just completely flipping a switch and everything is automated.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times there's a lot of improvements you can make without necessarily automating things with technology. It could just be more general process improvements or leveraging the technology you already have. So it doesn't even necessarily need to require some big, massive investments in new technology to get some low hanging fruit.
Absolutely. And I think we talk about that in a variety of things. And not only there's a lot you can do internally to optimize the digital transformation experience, but also there's a lot you can do to create a hybrid experience too. And we talk a lot about that with our cloud models, that it doesn't always have to be one or the other. There is room for a phased approach or a growth scale within that overall process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, one other interesting piece of research that I found actually in the Wall Street Journal was talking about the real big gap between um, enterprise technology and personal technology, and why that is, because there seems to be an ease of use factor to straight to consumer technology, as opposed to when you go on your work technology. A lot of times we have authentication, we have all the different security measures that need to be taken when it comes to personal data and within a business environment. So one thing I wanted to get your take on is this. They talk about developing a co-working experience rather than a solution, and that seems to be the theme for these last two articles and pieces of research, that technology is now becoming almost part of the work experience, so there needs to be an ease of use for it. So when you talk about some system that the frontline employee interacts with on a daily basis, say 100 times, and either they hate it and they'll find alternative ways to work around it, or they actually leverage the system and utilize for what it's supposed to actually be in providing value to their overall job flow. So what they called for in this research was make sure to source employee feedback on the technology. And that's one thing that I haven't in my work experience always seen, is a straight line of feedback towards a system within a business. A lot of times it's like, oh, that's the way that it is, that's just the way that it works, and those types of things. And I wondered if I could get your thought on if that really is kind of shifting, where maybe employees might have a more autonomous platform to provide feedback to their enterprise regarding technologies, and even just a bit more controllables around the type of technologies they utilize.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dichotomy or difference between the workplace technologies and the consumer technologies, and especially when you look at the world of Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter, and some of the um, or TikTok is actually what I meant to say. Twitter, maybe not so much, but some of these more really modern platforms that are super easy to use and intuitive, and then you get to these enterprise technologies as workforce or workplace technologies, and they're a lot more difficult to use. And what's interesting is this dynamic has always been there. I mean, even in the late '90s, you had like AOL, which at the time was like a revolutionary consumer, not a website, but platform that could be used. But then during that same era, you had AOL, which was pretty slick for its time. But then workplaces were using old mainframe green screen systems where you had to memorize 4-digit transaction codes. And some organizations, believe it or not, are still running that. So you look at this disconnect between a 23-year-old coming out of college who is used to TikTok and Instagram. Now you're going to try and teach them to learn how to use a 4-digit transaction code to enter a purchase order or whatever you want them to do in the system. That's a pretty big disconnect. So I think you have to really keep a pulse on consumer technology and also find out what employee needs are and how you can better enable, the overall employee experience. But at the same time, it can't be a full-blown democracy, if you will, in terms of a bottoms-up democracy on the technologies that you use, because you need to be pretty deliberate and strategic about how you're going to use technology and what the priorities are. So I think it's just a matter of finding that right balance. And most organizations probably fall too far down the extreme of having that disconnect between consumer technologies versus the workplace technologies.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, is that there has to be some sort of bottom line for employee expectations as well, or there's just chaos and disorganization, and that's not effective or efficient in any way. Something else that this research talked about was the over customization of legacy systems. And as an expert in that field, I really wanted to get your feedback on that, because it's almost like these enterprises have customized and added bolt-ons and different applications, and now they have processes that can't even be matched with normal, or I guess I shouldn't say normal, I should say modern, say technology-wise systems or ERP systems. And I wanted to see if that was something that you see a lot, maybe a business that had over customized or something like that.
Yeah, it's super common. And I don't even want to say that it's historically super common, becoming less common because newer platforms are so much easier to use, and therefore there isn't a need to customize as much. The industry says that, but that's not true. I mean, what you're seeing is that I'd say there's just as much, maybe even more customization today than there was 5, 10, 20 years ago. So good news, bad news is, technology has advanced quite a bit in the last several years. It's become more flexible. It's become easier to customize and to personalize for what your needs are. But the bad news is that it also creates the temptation to want to customize just because you can. And so that's a age-old debate on, do we allow customization because our people want it? And back to your earlier question about, do we want to just do what people from the bottom up tell us that they want to do from a technology perspective, or do we have more of a top-down sort of strategic, priority-driven approach to technology? Those two things factor in, and it's also a symptom of change management, or lack thereof. So when there's resistance to change, typically that manifests itself in customization. Because if I don't like the way an off-the-shelf system works and I don't want to change, one way around that would be to customize the software to do it the way I want it to do things.
So that brings me to my last piece of research here that talks about a study that was conducted in November of 2021 here in the United States, that talked about absolutely huge gaps in the labor market and this great reshuffling, where it really is, now we have over 10 million job openings in the United States here, and the ability of technology to really change that employee experience. So this piece talks about how leaders are now facing this question, and we kind of just talked about, like, how do we leverage our technology to communicate, to collaborate, and really to connect our company culture in a hybrid or remote working environment. And while technology is obviously not the only solution there, you can just think about it in the context that we were just talking about it. If you do have really challenging technical systems that maybe don't all integrate together, or don't connect in general, it can be very difficult for your workforce to connect. So the study showed that employees are much more likely to stay at an organization if they do have quote unquote user-friendly technology, and then over 300% more engaged within the overall employee workforce. So I think that that's a key trend as we look into what does this post-COVID world, and they actually call it COVID tech now, because we just add tech to everything, and that's how that works. But it has become a space in which organizations really have to fulfill in order for the employee experience to be positive. So I wanted to see if you had worked with any organizations that were maybe forced into a COVID tech transformation or something like that, where they needed to be able to work in a different environment than they used to, and it really impacted their overall employee experience.
Yeah, you have, you certainly had during COVID, the small percentage of workers that had the ability to work remotely or in a hybrid work environment. That certainly, there's a sort of a forced transformation happening there. You also saw forced transformations in certain industries like retail. Obviously, is our the change was already happening in the retail space where organizations and demand was moving away from bricks and mortar toward more e-commerce. But that was just accelerated and fast-tracked during COVID because we had to. It was a necessity. But even beyond retail, there's been sort of a ripple effect of just that one sort of mindset of e-commerce and sort of an omni-channel approach to where I could go to a store or I could order online. I can order online but return the products in the store. That sort of mentality has now rippled and domino or cascaded into other industries too. So like B2B types of businesses selling industrial products to other manufacturers, for example. Now it's created this sort of e-commerce mentality where we're going to create more of an omni-channel sort of experience for B2B organizations. And that's something that wasn't very common 5 or 10 years ago. But with COVID and just the whole paradigm shifting with people's expectation, and back to your earlier question about consumer grade technology versus workplace technologies and the differences between them, you're starting to see that come together now where people's lives, their personal lives and their work lives are sort of intermingling, and the expectations around technology and the usage of technology is converging as well.
Absolutely. And it surfaced a question for me that I wanted to ask you that wasn't referenced in this specific research, but I wondered if there's a place for like autonomous platforms within the workforce environment where you don't feel as though, the company's reading everything that you're chatting or something like that. Um, do you think that that's a, a good idea or a dangerous idea, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think I don't know. I guess it depends on the type of culture you're trying to drive as an organization, your management style, what your priorities are. If you take more of a command and control approach, maybe it makes sense to have more visibility into what employees do at a micro level. But with that comes a sort of a level of distrust, between management and employees. So I think you really have to, look at both sides of that.
Yeah, definitely. It would be interesting to have a platform, and maybe it already exists, where there's some sort of screen, if you will. So maybe you get really top line analytics like word clouds or, content themes, but you don't exactly know where they came from or who essentially sent them, just in case there is kind of any sort of pockets of toxicity within your culture, you're able to address that. So just an interesting kind of evolution that we continue to watch here every week with our hot topics. And I'm excited to hear from Christina, our next guest from CSU, who is near and dear to my heart because I am a Colorado State University graduate. So I was very excited to have her on board. And I think that your live stream with her and just overall conversation about the integration of kind of that people piece of the people process technology and what that looks like from someone who is an IT professor is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting, and I'm excited to have her on to talk about. It's always interesting to marry sort of the academic side of change and technology, digital transformation with the pragmatic, real world side of it, and seeing how that all comes together. And that's exactly why we wanted to have her on the show, was to talk about the psychology of digital transformation and how individual behaviors and motives and even cultures at the organizational level, at the geographic level, how that all influences digital transformation and how digital transformation affects culture and individuals. So kind of looking at both sides of the equation there. So we'll take a quick break. We'll have Dr. Christina Serrano from Colorado State University on the show. Kyler's alma mater. You'll get to hear one of her one of the professors from her alma mater on the show when we take a quick, or after we take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. My name is Eric Kimberly. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and all the audio podcast platforms as well, so be sure to check us out every Wednesday. I'm excited for our first guest on the show here today, which is Dr. Christina Serrano from Colorado State University. We wanted to have her on the show to talk about the psychology of digital transformation, the culture, the individual motives, what makes people tick, and how that all intersects with digital transformation and technology in general. So we thought it'd be a great conversation based on some of her research and experience over the last couple of decades in the space. So with all that being said, Christina, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I saw Kyler's message in the chat, go Rams, and I just want to echo that, go Rams. So just a little bit about myself. I do have a PhD. My field is management information systems. I got my PhD from the University of Georgia, the Terry College of Business. And but my first degree was actually public health as an undergrad. So I have this very mixed background where I really have a love for public health and health and promotion in general. But I also really love IT. So I did my best to kind of marry the two when I worked on my dissertation at the University of Georgia. So my dissertation research was on telehealth implementations and various aspects of that, organizational implementation from, the actual consultation and what could lead to more successful consultations in the telemedicine space. My work experience in academia is, I'm here at Colorado State University, but before I came here, I worked at the University of Arkansas in the Walton College of Business for a while. And that's actually where I was exposed more to ERP, because that's where my department chair asked me to teach ERP. And I was like, yeah, I've never touched an ERP. And he sent me to all sorts of training. And now it's 10 years later, and I've been teaching ERP for about 10 years now at the college setting, both undergraduate and graduate. And so I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell,
Great.
I'm glad that we were able to connect and kind of get more of that industry connection with ERP.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is how we connected, is through your class and having me join one of your classes to speak recently. So I appreciate that invitation. You may have already answered this question or alluded to it, but I want to make sure I don't gloss over or miss it. But how did you make that pivot from public health and undergrad and that sort of area of concentration to then IT? I know you said you had someone at the school, at your previous school, that asked you to teach ERP, but was there more to it than that, or was there already sort of a natural extension from the public health HR types of focus to general IT?
Well, since I was a kid, I really cared about health and well-being. I was in sports. I cared about nutrition. It's just kind of a weird kid like that, I guess. it seemed like a natural major to choose. And I even did a research fellowship at the CDC as an undergraduate. So I was really trying to, go all in. This was the late 90s. And so that was when everyone was getting those AOL CDs in the mail and, to connect to the internet. And so it wasn't even really a choice, honestly, to go into IT. It just was the timing of how things were unfolding, in technological advancements and how it was permeating mainstream society, because I just got sucked in. I couldn't help it. I learned on my own how to develop websites, as a public health major, and got a part-time job doing that as well. So by the time I graduated, I was hooked. And my first job was as a web developer. So, I don't know that there are connections between public health and IT for sure. At the time, I didn't know it. So, when I did my fellowship at the CDC, it's when I really understood what public meant in public health, and I was like, oh, public, that means people, like a lot of people, not even just, one-on-one, like in healthcare where you have just a patient. Public health deals with populations of people and population health. And I understood very clearly that there was no way to go into that field and not have to work with people just all the time. And so, I was like, web development, super fun. I'm just sitting there at my desk and playing around on the computer. And public health is just lots of complexity, lots of people. Little did I know, though, that the field of information systems and IT actually deals with a lot of people, too. So it was just a naive, misunderstanding my part at the time. But now I understand that there's actually a lot of overlap.
Yeah. It sounds like there's probably more similarities than either of us realized.
Yes, for sure. And I think even the pandemic, probably showed a lot of that too. People's resistance to change and misunderstandings about innovations, even though they're in the medical field. It's all very similar.
Right.
Similar stuff.
Right. Well, before I jump into some of the questions here, I'm gonna get to your research here in a moment. Just some of the research you've done and just kind of what have you learned in this space over the last couple decades. But before I do that, I just want to give a quick shout out to some of the audience members that are joining here today. Tatiana from Los Angeles, Jerry from Toronto, Jennifer from Southern California, Dennis from India, AWB Solutions from Philippines, and Gassan from Middle East. We got someone from Mexico. We got a 49ers fan. I'm not sure why we'd have a 49ers fan on the on the session here today, but just kidding. That's Tatiana, who's the 49ers fan. And also thanks everyone for letting us know where you're joining from today. It's always good to see where in the world everyone is here today. And again, be sure to drop any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to your questions as we get going here. So this is a really broad question that could go a million different directions, and I fully acknowledge it. It may not be fair as a first question or a first real question for you, but I'll ask it anyway and see if we can do maybe a flyover view or a summary. But when you think about the time you've spent in IT and the research you've done in the world of academia, what are some of the biggest takeaways or lessons that you have from, the things you didn't know 20 years ago when you started doing this stuff till now? What are some of those biggest lessons learned or takeaways from your research?
Yeah. So I'm a big picture thinker like you. So I think I might start more at the big picture level,
Sure.
And then where it's brought me today. And so, I started my PhD in 2006. In the very first year of my PhD program, we have to learn a lot of fundamentals about research, about our discipline. And so, my discipline being information systems. And a lot of people confuse information systems with computer science or, computer engineering and don't really understand the difference. And where I am right now, it's actually, my department is computer information systems. So it makes it even more confusing. But what was really clear, in that first year of my PhD program is understanding, of course, what is information systems as a discipline? What does it mean? And our discipline is essentially captures the combination of people, processes, and technologies, and how they all have to come together, work together to manage information to achieve organizational goals. And ideally shared goals, right? is what we want. Still, at that time in 2006, the field as a whole was a bit disrupted. Around that time, it was after the dot-com bust, and there were declining enrollments, not just in information systems, but also computer science and other computing fields. And so we were all kind of in this identity crisis, really trying to understand, how can we remain relevant and serve the needs of the future. So in my field, there were a slew of publications around that time, or they had come out a few years earlier when I had started the PhD program. So they were still fairly fresh. And it was kind of, who are we? What kind of things are we supposed to teach and publish? The battle was really more of this holistic information systems. Are we all of this? Because, isn't that more management? Isn't that psychology? Isn't it all these other disciplines? And so we did really hone in on the tech. I think that's what really won the day in that feud about who are we as a field. And so subsequently, every paper you submit to a journal that about your research, there is this question: where's the IT artifact? Are you talking about IT at all? Because if not, maybe desk reject. We don't want to hear it. And I get that. I get that in terms of in a business college, we have to differentiate ourselves from management, from other disciplines. My sense now, all these years later, is it was a pretty big mistake for our field to take that turn, because it's really in the holistic space of people, processes, and technology, and how they have to work together synergistically in a really careful dance, almost like a marriage. That's where innovation really takes place. Once you take the IT out of the people and the processes and try to look at it alone, you miss out on a lot of the things that your firm is trying to do, right? When you're talking about these major organizational IT implementations, it's not just about the IT. In fact, it's usually the IT is not the problem. Usually it's usually in the people and the processes and that space. And unfortunately, I do feel a lot of researchers who have been responsible for kind of researching this and teaching it and innovating in this space have done exactly what industry has done, and that's look at the tech, kind of, and not look at the whole picture.
Yeah, it's easy to become enamored by the technology and focus on bells and whistles and innovations in the pure tech space without looking at the people and process.
Absolutely. I mean, we still will look at things like tech's impact on organizational performance, and our outcome variables are still very relevant to a business. It's just we're not looking at our models holistically to account for a lot of the people and processes too, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a good point, and that's a lot of what we want to talk about, especially the technology and people in particular. I think that's a lot of what we'll cover here today. Of course, processes fit into that as well. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll pick up the conversation with Christina. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The
The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings. And the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 Replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Bad to the bone.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. We're here with Christina Serrano talking about the psychology of digital transformation. But in speaking of that, I guess just to kind of shift gears and maybe dive into that a little bit more, part of your research I know focuses on how IT impacts individual identities and cultures. Just what are some of your high-level observations or thoughts or learnings in that area in terms of how tech affects or transformation affects, we'll call it digital transformation affects individual and identities and cultures and vice versa as well?
Yeah. So, when I first started to do research in the organizational space, I was really interested in organizational culture. And so I started a study. It's a longitudinal case study. This was actually looking at libraries because at the time, it was 2007, I had access to a particular case, a library that had been built and open, and it has no books. It was intentionally designed to be a bookless electronic library, still a physical space, but looks very different when you walk into it. And that actually meant everything. So we were looking at culture, in terms of how did the librarians adjust to this, and what does it mean in terms of their culture as an organization in this bookless library. But what we actually found was, when I say we, I have one collaborator at the University of Georgia, Dr. Marie Boudreau. We found was that their identities, within the culture space, identity really became a prominent theme in their identity threats and how they responded to those identity threats. So, culture is very important, but I think where my research has taken me is that within the culture space, identity is almost everything, because it deals with who we are as human beings, even in the workspace. Who are we as a librarian, if I'm a librarian, and the threats to that. I found that, we all respond to identity threats. We all have usually our default is some sort of defensive or protective type of response to start. And that's exactly what they did as well. They were really trying to say, hey, we're still relevant in this space. We're not going to be one of these groups that gets sucked into de-skilling because of technology. We want to make sure we're still relevant. But no matter what they did, they could not combat the misperceptions of the people they were serving. So it didn't matter how often they put up, say, read posters, for example, of celebrities reading books in the building. It didn't matter how often they had a portable bookmobile for checkout, or all the things that they tried to do to say, hey, we're still librarians and this is a library, so please use it like a library instead of a computer lab. It just didn't work. It didn't work. They tried to even, change the desktops on the computers to be more like, hey, you're in a library, but their patrons still looked at them like directional assistants at the desk. Would still ask, where's the bathroom, where's the stapler? And these are people with master's degrees or higher. They are very skilled in their expertise. So what we found is that when the masses kind of when it becomes imbued more in the societal culture, because this wasn't the only place where it's becoming digitized and as a library, and you're now going to databases, right, to look at research. You're not pulling books and journals from the shelves and photocopying anymore. That's just not the behavior that the patrons are engaged in. So when that happens, there's really no stopping the train. It doesn't matter what, as an organization, you try to do to say, hey, we want to resist this, or say, it's still this old model, or, so what they had to do was essentially embrace it. They just had to make it a part of who they are. So they had to adapt their identity to this new technological landscape, because that's the only way to stay relevant. And even though this was a case study, a longitudinal case study with a library and librarians, I do think the lessons gleaned from that case study are generalizable. The way that consumers, the way that it's just all baked into our societal culture, technological adoption, there's no stopping that train, really. I think organizations just have to embrace it, have to respond to it, have to understand the employees that they onboard that are even younger generation. I mean, it's different. There's a different culture.
Yeah.
And so culture, identity, it's all very much tied together.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, Sam Graham on LinkedIn has an interesting related question, which is, to what extent is organizational culture affected by the culture of the country that it is in? For example, he worked in a country where it's considered rude to say no. And so how do you navigate, some of those geographic cultures? Because I think what you're talking about is more just the culture of an organization, or the individual trace of a individual. But how does a geographic culture affect all this?
Oh, for sure. And I encourage Sam to take a look at, there's a website well, this was actually national culture. So I think that's what he's talking about, though, country culture too. Hofstede is a big name in that space, and there are researchers who will take some of his research with a grain of salt, but that's, any research, truly, anything that's produced by humans, you know that there's going to be some flaws in it. But if you look up Hofstede national culture, you'll find that it's even searchable. It's a really great website because you can compare national cultures as well. So for example, it would put United States as a highly individualistic, that's in our culture. It also says that in the United States, we have more of a short-term orientation instead of a long-term orientation. So that even filters into how we have quarterly reports and shorter reporting times for some of our goal settings. But there's these lots of different dimensions, even masculinity to femininity, and that's why some of this has been questioned, but it's been research out there for decades, and so I would encourage them to check that out. But it does definitely have some impact for sure. Even in the pandemic, we saw that, right? I think that, some societies that were just inherently more collectivism in their national culture, the way that they responded compared to countries that were much more individualistic in their culture, just totally different, right? I don't know that there's a whole lot we can do to change, something as big as national culture. But what Sam is saying is, like, it's considered rude to say maybe no in a culture. I mean, I think all we can do is kind of more educate ourselves and ask questions. That's all I have for that. But yeah.
Well, and this kind of builds on a point that you just mentioned as far as one of the dimensions of culture with masculinity and femininity. And this question is from Kyler on LinkedIn, who asks, in honor of National Women's Day, which I didn't know it was National Women's Day. So good to know. Thanks, Kyler, for pointing that out. And building on identity, how is women in technology shifting and cultural misperceptions transitioning?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if we're seeing a huge increase in women, flooding to STEM fields yet, but there definitely has been an uptick in efforts, in recruiting and trying to be more mindful of what are the barriers. Even at CSU, the computer science department and my department, computer information systems, we received a joint grant through Northeastern University. It's from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to increase, women enrollment in our programs, so our concentrations, our certificate programs. I mean, there's more awareness about it. I don't know yet if we've totally untangled all of the barriers truly. What are the real reasons that are preventing women from maybe even choosing this as a concentration or a career, but also retention. So keeping women in these fields is also difficult if they choose it to begin with. That they'll tend to leave, so turnover can be high. It's getting better. That's all I can say. It's getting better. We're working on it. I hope to see a lot of improvement in this area in the next, hopefully, 10 years.
And I imagine it's a lot of variation in different parts of the world and different cultures of how far that's come along versus not. And maybe in 10 years, we get a little bit more even in terms of how we've evolved
Yeah.
there.
I think so. I mean, what we're finding is that the interventions that we would implement to increase women enrollment actually just increases enrollment, period, across the board, across all demographics. I think the barriers preventing women from choosing these careers are also preventing a lot of other people, whether they're women or not, from choosing these careers. A lot of it has to do with stereotypes, myths that we have to debunk about STEM fields. So it's a lot of work to be done, honestly.
Yeah. And actually, we I may have unintentionally stirred some controversy on YouTube. I think what he's saying, Nanudin on YouTube is saying, I thought it's International Women's Day, not National Women's Day. So if I misspoke there, thank you for the correction. I'm not sure if it's national, just a U.S. thing, or if it's international.
Sure.
But, point's still the same, though, as far as women involvement in technology. So here's another question that's actually going to lead into a question that we have here on LinkedIn that I want to get to, but I kind of want to segue into it. But the question is, when you and I talked, kind of preparing for this interview, you talked a little bit about the neuroscience of human behavior and change. And I'll fully admit I'm getting way over my head here as we talk about neuroscience.
Oh, I'm not a neuroscientist either. I want to be very clear.
Okay. You probably know more about it than I do, but
Okay.
which isn't saying a lot, I suppose. But when you look at neuroscience and human behavior and change, what are some of your learnings or observations in that realm?
Yeah. So what I'm learning is that research is just really coming out about some of this now. So if you looked to the research before 10, 20 years ago, even the capabilities to conduct this research were not nearly as robust as they are now. So it's been about 10 years in the information system space that we've had this sub-discipline that's kind of emerged, or this sub sort of research area, and it's called neuro-IS. And there are even colleges of businesses in the world now that have these more neuro kind of labs for research. So they're equipped with, EEG, eye tracking, other types of biosensing data that can track like heart rate, perspiration. There are some researchers in IS now getting into studies that leverage fMRI technology for brain scanning. Obviously, we have to do a lot of partnering with other disciplines in medicine to be able to best interpret this data and understand what it means. But all of that kind of stemmed from most behavioral research, is subjective, in the way that we measure it. We get a lot of self-report data, perception-based type data on surveys, or, we might observe behaviors, but then we're not really in the minds of people to understand, what's making them behave that way. So I'm really excited that we're getting into, that's the nice thing about Moore's Law, right? Is that we are getting even better brain scanning kind of tech to be able to use for research, even some, like EEG that's portable now. So we'll be able to have people wear these sort of nets. Maybe there's a way they can hide it, but, it connects to their brains, and it can be scanning, more continuously or all day. So they can, we could see how they actually interact outside of a laboratory space, with the technology they're using. How is it while they're driving, how, when they're shopping in a store, when versus when they're at home. So across context, it's really exciting. So that's number one, is that, one, we're just really now starting to see this research come out from a more neuroscience standpoint of, behavior change and what triggers it. Two, I think there's just a lot we're going to find out, honestly, because of that in the next 5 to 10 years, about the way humans really tick, the way their brains tick, and how this bleeds into the organizational space, and how people even work together. Forget technology, how do just people work together in teams and make that collaboration work so we can have innovation. I believe, because we've talked, you and I have talked, so this isn't based on any fMRI data or anything, or any studies that I've done. So I just want to make that clear. It's just based on a lot of what I've read from studies that have been done and what I've observed in my own research. Is, I think that, people have inherently, I think this is nature, different types of processors in their brains, and we don't know it, we don't even realize it. We're talking about things now, unconscious biases, implicit biases, and things like that, that, over 90%, of the decisions we make are unconscious, and we don't necessarily know why. We're kind of operating off of different scripts we've developed. So I think that once we start looking under the hood a little bit more, so to speak, and in the way that our brains work, we're going to find out that a lot of organizational conflict probably stems from people who think differently. They have different thinking orientations, and they just don't even realize it. It's almost like we're speaking different languages, but we don't even know it.
Yeah, and it, you're touching on this whole thread, or this whole thought, that there's so many complexities and layers of the complexities of change in terms of the people impact, because you have sort of that you have the, call it the geographic culture, or sort of the broad-based culture of wherever the organization is, or whatever country or religion, or whatever the location is, and then below that you have the culture of the organization, which could vary even in the same geography. And then within that one organization with that distinct culture, you have individuals now with different things that make them tick, and different psyche, things that motivate them to change or not.
Yep. Yes. And so it's really interesting, because, I think we just really never talked about it at all before. We just, now there's a little more openness and transparency. So I see this as a professor. In the last 10 years, there's definitely more of an openness, say, even of students, divulging, different information about the way that they might process information, or, issues that they might have. And so, we've had huge increase in accommodations that we provide for students. And in that space, they're referred to as disabilities, but truly, I don't think a lot of these things are actually disabilities. I think this is just people who are oriented differently. They think differently. They might For example, I think there are some people with ADHD, for example, who are diagnosed who might just have a different relationship with time, perceive it a bit differently than others and process it differently in their brains. I don't know that that's necessarily a disability, but it is something to accommodate in a space where we're trying to use these sort of one size fit all approaches to how, we teach and how we do different things in organizations. We want to have a policy that works for everybody. We want to have, processes that work for everybody. But instead of, thinking about at the individual level how people are going to have different needs in the processes, we try to sort of retrofit the people to the processes. So some get accommodations, some kind of fit, some, and in my mind, I'm like, I don't know that that's really the way to do it. I think we can design our processes much smarter, so that they do just naturally accommodate everybody, no matter where they come from or what they're bringing to the table.
Right.
But that requires process reengineering and rethinking the way we do things and changing status quo and norms. And that's just really hard.
Scary.
Yeah. It's kind of what you do and consult on, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think you said it well when you said there is no one size fits all approach to change, and nor can there be when you look at those three layers of overall culture, organizational culture, and then individual motives. So that's a great point. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll pick up the conversation with Christina. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. We're here with Christina Serrano talking about the psychology of digital transformation. So maybe building on that a bit more, here's a question from Andre on YouTube. He asked the question of how adaptable are individuals in high-power distance societies insofar as ERP and IT and digital change is concerned. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a
question.
But I didn't expect that one. Thanks, Andre. Okay, so high power distance. So that would mean there's more authority and there's more respect for authority in high power distance cultures. They're very hierarchical. And it's interesting because I think in the United States, for example, if you look at Hofstede's website, I'm guessing I have to look at it, but if I had to guess, it would probably say we have more of a low power distance culture, meaning, there's a lot more individual freedoms. There's more, participative input, it's more democratic, all these sorts of things. What I find, though, is that even if at a national level you might have that stipulated as a culture, that doesn't mean that's what's represented in organizations, right, in that culture. And you see that in the United States a lot too, where we still do have hierarchical kind of structures with power distance in organizations. The CEO is always going to have more power than someone who's just newly onboarded as a newcomer to the organization, fresh out of their degree program. But yes, in high power distance societies, I would say that it says how adaptable are individuals. I think that it would in some ways also hinge on how faithful, I guess, that society can be to that particular element, that dimension of culture. In a very strict standpoint, I would say high power distance, that would mean that authority is respected, and if they do have that respect, then they can make their followers adapt, when they need to adapt. But that only works, when the individuals are willing to follow that authority and that power. And I think that it's one thing to see something in theory, in a model with boxes and arrows and whatnot, but seeing it instantiated in practice, in reality, in the way that humans actually, in our real worlds, it usually doesn't work that cleanly. So I would say, I would say, could be really adaptable if that high power structure is really respected and ethical, right? And so the people buy into it. But if there's doubts, if there are doubts, just like in an organization, right, among the followers about what those in power are deciding the humans need to do to adapt, then you'll still get that resistance. And if they're too controlling or too kind of authoritarian in the way that they try to implement that change, you also might get resistance, but again, that's from individuals who might be like, that's not ethical, right? Like, I want to follow leaders and authority who have my best interests at heart too.
Yeah. It also seems like you might have a higher resistance to change, or more of a change issue, if your organizational culture, especially in a host needs model, is different than the national culture. So in other words, as you're talking, it made me think, well, if I'm an American, which I am, I'm in the US, and I'm used to this lower power distance sort of approach, but I work for an organization that's more command and control. Does that, I wonder if that dissonance between like the organizational culture and the country
absolutely
culture, that could create more problems.
Absolutely, it would, because what my research is taking me to is the individual level. I mean, I know we're looking at a lot of things more at the macro level, but it all starts more at a local level, and at an individual. And this might have a Western bias, because that's a lot of the research I look at. It's all stuff published in English and stuff like that. But at least, what I've been reading would indicate that individuals, even as employees in organizations, are moving towards a place of wanting more authenticity in the workplace, wanting to be able to align their personal values, all the way up to, org, national, they want that alignment, you know what I mean? Because when you have all those conflicts, that's where things really do fall apart. So, if a person has high moral values in terms of, say, equity or fairness, and that's something they really feel strongly about, if they don't see that being enacted in their organization, in which they work, they may end up jumping ship. I think we're seeing a lot more turnover in organizations now, as people are kind of like, you know what, I really want to find a place that aligns with my values too,
Yeah. So that alignment is important, I suspect, and that's something I hadn't thought of before. And then the other dimension here that this sort of, or another semi-rabbit hole that this takes my brain down, is when you think about the effect that this all has on people, and just what the overall impact is, and how the culture is affected by that. How is resistance to change? How does resistance to change manifest itself in that? I mean, in terms of, let me rephrase it. Maybe I'm having trouble getting this thought out, or this question out. But when you think about the way you might want to change your culture, let's try this. If you recognize that you're a command and control, authoritarian type of organization, in theory, and if that's aligned with your national culture, in theory, maybe people will change because it's aligned with the culture they're used to. That's the way the organization is. You tell them to change, and they're gonna change. I'm oversimplifying, but that same organization may say, well, maybe we should be a little bit more collaborative, or a little bit less power what's it called, a little lower power distance as a
Right.
culture. You're not going to change that overnight. So how do you see culture potentially evolving as a result of the digital transformation or an IT initiative?
I mean, I really think I mean, you might not like this answer, Eric, but I think it's, your work and organizations that do the kind of work you do are going to become really, really important in the next 10 years. I mean, you've been important, but as we see, technology is rapidly accelerating. We're talking about exponential growth, and so it's just going to get faster and more complex. And it's already been difficult for us to adjust to. So I imagine in the future, it's going to become even more challenging. So those who do more of what you do are going, you might have to, and we can maybe talk in another meeting, but I think that, there might be some additional things you might have to bring to the table to organizations to really help smooth some of these transitions. Because, we talk a lot at the macro level, but I think everything we see at the more macro level are side effects or downstream effects from what actually happens at the individual level, in each employee, in each individual citizen in a society, because we're the ones who come together and then create these macro phenomena together. But until we can get more at the individual level, people willing to change, I mean, there's a reason New Year's resolutions never go well, generally speaking. I mean, this is forever, year after year, this never changes. So it's something that really needs to be tapped more at the individual level. And like you said, there's no cookie cutter solution. There's no one size fits all. So it's going to have to be something that we have to figure out how to more on an individual basis understand what barriers exist for humans to change and evolve. And I don't think all of it exists in the business space. Again, this is my big picture thinking. I look at our inputs to organizations come from somewhere. They come from our K through 12 systems. They come through our college or higher ed systems. All of that has to adapt to the needs of the future and preparing our young learners for the needs of the future. But then we also have the folks like you and me and those older than us, some of us who've lived in a world where it's not this frenetic. It's not, we do remember a slower pace and when we could fax things and it wasn't all instantaneous, and we have to adapt too. We have to understand we're not living in the 1970s anymore or the 1980s. And there's never going to be a way to bring that back. It's like that ship has sailed.
Right.
So,
for better or worse, it's not coming back.
Yeah, but I think it has to be more at the individual level. And I do think that some of what we were talking about before about convergent thinking, divergent thinking, this is all stuff that's going to have to come to the table. And that's kind of akin to these ideas of vertical thinking and lateral thinking, which, again, deals with your space and ERP, right? In fact, the textbook I've used for years and years called it sideways thinking for like lateral thinking, and saying that all employees, this isn't just a management level requirement. All employees in an organization have to develop that sideways thinking or lateral thinking, being able to understand where, whatever they're doing in the organization, what comes before, what comes after, what are the impacts of your work on everything else in the organization? Because when we have people who are too vertical in their thinking, too convergent, we can get really high specialization and real high expertise, which is awesome. But it makes them blind to, the impact of that specialization, what they're doing and how it bleeds into the rest of the organization. So I don't know exactly how to change that, because I think some of that is more at the innate level, and some of how we're wired to think. But I think there are ways that we can, teach different ways of thinking, because I think no matter what our predominant orientations might be, we are all going to have to learn to be more than ambidextrous, in the way that we think, so that we can, invoke the right thinking tool set, in the moment. If there's something that requires a bit more creativity in the moment, do we know how to take that tool out of our toolkit and have that more creative thinking enacted? If we have to be a little bit more focused and vertical, do we know how to pull that tool out of our toolkit?
And what about convergent and divergent thinking? You mentioned that to me when we spoke before, in preparation for this discussion, and I found it super fascinating and super relevant to this whole world of transformation, digital transformation. So maybe help us understand what's the difference between the two, and how is that relevant to what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, and so when I say convergent thinking, this is also, you see it a lot more in this vertical thinking space, and it's more of, you're given a set of facts and information, and so both are problem solving types, ways of thinking.
Okay.
And so in convergent thinking, you're kind of given the information at the outset, but it's still complicated. You still have to figure out the right solution from all of those different facts. But there's usually one solution, like you're converging, right? You're focusing. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, is, you might not be presented with all of the facts and information you need to solve a problem. You're given a particular prompt and you're given a goal, like this is what we're going for. And then you have to go forage, explore, and figure out what different facts and what different solutions might be relevant. So you might not come up with what you come up with many different solutions to try to figure out which one might be the best, or maybe there's this whole set, right? That more than one answer can be right at a time, right? And that is just difficult for humans to accept, even in politics, right? It's there's always like, oh, my side's right, no, my side's right, and it's very seldom do we have people saying, actually it's all right, it's there, but we just have to pivot, twist, slice, dice, same things we do with data, right, to understand when this is right and when this is right. So siloed thinking, right? Organizations are siloed, they specialize, they have an accounting department, they have their HR department, they have, and that's just how organizations have been. I don't know, I imagine that's how yours might be too, divided. You have specialists. But anytime you have that really specialized knowledge, that it's going to really promote that vertical thinking instead of integrated, and instead of more divergent and lateral, sideways thinking. So I think some of it is just bringing this language to bear in organizations and saying, hey, these are things we have to work on. All individuals have to kind of work on both of these, because it's not like, oh, divergent thinking is better or lateral thinking is better. They're both really great, and they're both tools we should be sharpening.
Yeah, that's really well put, and a good summary. And it seems like that in our industry at times, it feels as though the convergent thinking or the vertical thinking is pushed a lot more. In other words, when you're a software vendor or a system integrator that specializes in one technology, that's the right answer, in your mind or in that world.
Standardized tests even, right? I mean, that's going to education, but there's always one right answer, right, on those, that you bubble in or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's even baked into our education systems. It's baked into how we teach people how to think. So that's something that, it's complicated. What you deal in is complicated because it's not just at the organizational level. There are impacts outside of organizations, even regulations and laws, and all of that will have an impact on how effectively an organization can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you helped me understand why, as a kid, I always struggled with multiple choice tests. I really struggled with them because to me there wasn't one answer. I always felt like there's two possible answers here. It depends.
Yeah. Absolutely. Me too.
And that's a way, I would say people going through a transformation, while you want to have some specialization, whether you're a technical person or business process or change management or program management, whatever it is, you need that specialization, but you also have to, I think, challenge yourself to be more divergent and look more integrated at the whole big picture, because I think that's where we mess up, is we focus so much on our myopic little areas, and these are big, massive transformations, and we don't get it right typically when we take that approach. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll pick up the conversation with Christina. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. We're here with Christina Serrano talking about the psychology of digital transformation. Another question I wanted to get at here, which I think is really interesting. This is from Gassan on LinkedIn. He asked, as companies become legacy with staff turnover for key positions at approximate 0 years, does organizational change resistance increase, whether intentional or unintentional? Has this been measured? So I think that, maybe to paraphrase or try to paraphrase, as organizations bring in newer, fresher, younger blood, whatever you want to call it, newer people to the organization, how does that affect resistance or acceptance of change? Have you seen any correlation there?
Yeah. Turnover is very disruptive to organizations. I see it now, even in my own organization. In the pandemic, there's been a really high turnover. And, even when you bring in new people, it's all of that conflict you're talking about. Is that value alignment there? As you bring in new individuals, are you also bringing in a wave of new types of values, that are reflected in a different generational space, and so I think it all depends. I hate to always give those answers, right? Like, it depends, but it does. It depends on, the culture of the organization to begin with, and, the culture that the incomers are bringing to the organization. But I would say in general, frequent turnover is not something an organization wants, because you can't keep your knowledge in place, that core knowledge base you might need. And I don't know, it's something about, it has something to do with culture and identity and this research, because all of that takes time to really form and solidify. And so when you have all of this, like these micro disruptions and stuff that punctuate that process, it's really hard to forge like a good culture and identity. At the same time, my ethical values would tell me that I think it's fine for people to leave organizations, right? And to try, new careers but at the same time, yeah, it does cause a bunch of disruption. I think until we can get systems, human resource systems that are more resilient, meaning, we have better systems where if somebody needs to tap out, someone else immediately taps in who can fill in, we can allow people to tap out more and, take the breathers that they need, or go back to school, or the things that we all want as humans to grow, without making them feel like, oh, I can't do that because maybe there's going to be negative consequences. If I leave, maybe they're not going to have someone for however long it takes to onboard someone new. That's the reason I don't leave a lot of times from organizations, because I understand the burden it's going to put on my colleagues until they find a replacement. So yeah, I don't know. I don't even know if I really answered that question well, but hopefully I gave them some insights to help.
Well, just another dimension that you have to think about as part of a transformation. I mean, you talked about layers of culture and individual motives and behaviors, and then you've got this whole thing with turnover and how tenured is the staff. That affects your culture, which affects how resistant or open to change that organization is going to be. So there's just so many moving parts you've got to consider in that roadmap.
Right. Yeah, because I think that the best change is enacted. Yeah, I know we always talk about buy-in and everything. I think that's all in the literature. But when there's genuine buy-in, but I think that buy-in has to come from a place not of leadership, providing the best, spiel about why they need to embrace change. I think it needs to come from a place within each individual person of being like, I value this. I value innovation. I value my company trying something new. I value learning new skills, so maybe I have to change my job role. Maybe I do, but I value learning and growing. So I'm going to go with it. Until we can get more of that, I think we're going to have problems with change, no matter the context.
Yeah, absolutely. One question that's a little bit off track from the thread, Ron, but I want to make sure we get to it before while we still have time here. And that is, and you mentioned this to me when we were prepping for the interview. You mentioned this to me in sort of in passing, so we didn't really dig into it very much. But I wanted to ask the question because I feel like you might have been onto something that would be relevant here, which is the relationships between novices and experts within digital transformation or any sort of change initiative. Is that something you've studied or read up on, or what are your thoughts on? And I don't know if this traces back. I think you were talking about in the context of your public health experience, if I remember correctly, like doctors and patients.
Right. Yeah, I did study novices and experts in the telemedicine consultation space. It absolutely it does, and even using that word novice and expert. I get it. I think expert, we're talking about that vertical thinking normally, is like that is somebody usually who has expertise, say, in software development or in finance or, in medicine, it might be a specialty. And then the novice is someone who doesn't have that knowledge, that specific knowledge. So what I'm finding is that those who exist more in the novice or follower space, that would even include citizens in a country, followers, we have a lot of responsibility. We have a big job to do, and especially in this upcoming, drastically changing, exponential tech world we live in. Right now, I think where followers generally impede change is that, followers, and I'm going to put myself as a follower because I'm not a CEO, I'm not a department chair, I'm not, I'll go ahead and say I'm a follower. We can't always expect leadership and authority to handle everything. We really can't. We have a responsibility as well to learn, to, be curious, to empathize, to try to understand the perspectives of leadership as well. But we tend to not do that. We're just not trained that way. It's not baked into our cultures all over the world. And so the way that bleeds into, the research I did in medicine is with telehealth is I interviewed numerous physicians across many different medical specialties, and they all consistently said patients are terrible information presenters. Terrible. So we, as a patient, will come to an appointment and we'll just expect the doctor to do everything, right? We expect them to ask the questions, run the tests needed, as though we have zero responsibility in this process. If instead, we were like, no, actually, housed in our brains is 90% or more of the information that healthcare providers actually need to help us, because that's also supported by research. The best way to diagnose a patient's condition usually comes from their medical history. And how does a medical professional know your medical history? You have to tell them, you have to bring that information to the appointment. Medications you're on. If you have a rash, did you take a picture of its development every single day? And did you come and bring that to the appointment? That would actually do a lot more to save people's lives than anything that a doctor can do. And that is cheap. That is actually not an expensive thing. And I think that in organizations, that's the thing that's almost maddening, and in society in general, because usually what's required is the cheapest, easiest, simplest solutions. Even just listening, for example. Imagine the money an organization can save if only each individual employee decided, hey, I'm going to listen a little bit more instead of just judge things right off the bat. But that's how it is. So, I think, as far as novices, experts, it absolutely, all of it will impede change. Even an expert, thinking, hey, I know best, could impede change. In the management research, there's a concept called reverse mentorship that's kind of making its way into a little bit of the mainstream. And it's this idea of, novices can actually mentor experts too. You know what I mean? It's not always the other way around. They have interesting, meaningful knowledge and expertise also to bear in an organization.
Yeah. And I think that if there's a way to divide the chasm between novice and expert, not that you expect the novice to become an expert or the expert to, back up into being a novice, but it seems like, at least in our world, and I think maybe this is true in the medical field and other industries too, but in the digital transformation world, we see the dynamic often where an organization almost has this learned helplessness. We're not the experts. This is a big disruptive change to our organization, so we're going to defer to you, third stage consulting, or you, system integrator, software vendor, or whatever expert you want to plug in here. We're going to defer to you to sort of fix this for us, and it creates this sort of expectation that I don't need to bring any real meaningful input to the table. And on the expert side, you have sort of the opposite, which is, I've done this a million times. I've got the answers. I've seen organizations just like you, and this is how software should be deployed, or how you should, leverage a new technology or whatever. I'm oversimplifying two extremes here, but I think though that dynamic seems like that creates a lot of problems in the world of transformation, blind spots.
Yeah, there's a reason I'm doing what I do and not what you do. You know what I'm saying? What you do seems really hard.
Yeah, it is. And but I think if we can be more mindful of that, those differences, I think that's huge. So maybe just a sort of a capstone summary, sort of wrap up sort of question. What based on everything we've talked about and all your studies and just what you've learned about IT and change and digital transformation over the years, what are some of the key nuggets of advice you'd give to an organization that's about to start on a transformation or a change initiative?
Right. Well, I mean, I exist more in the IT space, and as far as digital transformation, IT implementations, I mean, honestly, the things I would tell them that bear out from research are a lot of the things that you say too. When you say you wish you could just drop digital from the word transformation, for example, me too. Because it's I would say don't focus so heavily on the tech. Just don't. That's not where all of the problems lie. Also, consistently, time and time and time again, research does show that you can take adequate tech, decent tech, not even the most expensive tech, and pair it with exceptional people and processes, and you will get far superior results than any organization that puts the latest and greatest, most expensive tech in their organization. It means nothing if you don't have the people and processes that know how to exploit it and leverage it. So I would say people and processes is really, I mean, it's not the fun part. It's not the shiny, sexy part of anything, but that's where, if you want to be successful, right? If you're looking for results, that's where you need to focus your energy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I agree with you. And it makes you wonder if, every organization that's about to go through a transformation, if they were to just shift, say 20, 25%, let's say, of their focus, resources, time, money on the technology, maybe buy 20, 25% less of what you're planning. Don't invest as much in the technology and shift some of that focus over to the people and process side of things, that I would take that bet every day, over that
Yeah.
company that throttles back on their tech spending and increases
That's-
spending in the other areas.
That's what my dissertation research showed too. So in telehealth consultations, the most effective consultations, meaning they were able to diagnose the patient's health condition accurately, that happened in an audio only condition. So this was a lab experiment. That happened with the lowest tech you can possibly have in that consultation, which is just talking like on the phone. But it was paired with an exceptional interviewer. So the expert had to be really high in their interview skills and diagnostic skills. So it's their process skills, what they're specialized in. And then on the novice end, the patient end, they also had to have really high presentation skills. So they had to be the patients who came with the photos with the rashes, who came with their medical history. So when you have those pieces in place, you only need really a phone, right? Because the information is exchanged through the humans in a very high quality way. But I don't think we think about that enough. And training people, I think it might be harder, but I think it would save organizations so much money instead of just trying to outsource it all to the tech.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, that's a good place to leave it. I think if you're going to leave one nugget or if you take one thing away from this discussion, I think that's a really good place to leave it. Well, good. Well, thank you for being on the show. That it flew by, and I didn't get through all my questions. The audience we didn't get to all the audience questions either, and we could easily spend another hour on this, but I want to thank you for being on the show here, Christina.
Oh my gosh, thank you. And thank you for all the questions. And this was my first podcast for everybody listening. So thank you for joining me on my first podcast.
All right. Thank you, Christina. Great conversation. Really interesting stuff. A lot of stuff I had not thought about and was not aware of as it relates to change and digital transformation. So let's unpack some of those concepts a bit more. But first, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 59. We just had Christina Serrano on the show talking about the psychology of digital transformation. And what were some of your observations or thoughts related to that conversation, Kyler?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a great conversation and exciting to have, my school where I learned so much be featured on Transformation Ground Control. So near and dear to my heart for sure. I think it's always interesting, when we do have professors on it, the thing that always stands out to me is how nervous they are. And I'm always like, you stand up in front of kids that can be ruthless and you're nervous for this, but she did such a great job. Especially I like how she explained, what does information systems really mean? And a lot of times we constitute information systems as kind of hard coded systems, as software, as those types of things. And she really said within that overall identity of information systems that it is the people, the process, and the technology. All of those should be the system, not the actual software. So I thought that was a really great way to put it. She reminds me a lot. Do you know who Brene Brown is?
Don't. I feel like I should, or the name sounds familiar. But
Yeah, I'm sure you will. So Brene Brown is a a professor as well. She researches really intangible things a lot of time, like shame and psychology, and she's a well-known author type of thing. Christina reminds me of that from the technical side of the overall conversation on more of an IT level. So talking about things like the synergy needed between these areas, and just talking about how identity is really everything, she said, which I wrote down. And then our default is kind of defense and fear. And that's where a lot of kind of any sort of resistance is born from when it comes to that overall circle of life, if you will, Lion King reference, when it comes to people, process, and technology. So I thought that was, such a really great holistic observation of what really digital transformation should be to an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I also thought it was really interesting when we were talking about the learning process too, and I think that's really resonates with me. And I don't know about you, but I was never a great student because I learned different than other people did, and a lot of times, you want to be fit into this box. And I think there's an opportunity now as we not only evolve the learning process, but to evolve the overall technology industry to fit a different way of creative thinking. And I think that made me really excited about her future students in just seeing that as something that could be of value, not, hey, you can't do calculus, so that means you can't be, involved in the technology space. That misperception seems to be evolving within higher education, which I'll be honest, I never really thought that was going to happen. I thought that was just kind of a box you had to check, kind of get through it. And then when you're in the career space, you're able to express yourself differently than academia. But it seems as though, at least in her overall classes, that is actually changing. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I did too. That was really cool.
And then I wanted to ask you, since I wrote down the brain sensing nets when she was talking about that, and my mind went right to wearable technology, right? So we have the watches, we have the smart necklaces, we have now what if we have like wearable nets, like in hats or something, that can sense our overall brain function. And it sounds like that technology is something that's really becoming a data point, especially within kind of when we talk about learning processes or just the overall psychology of how a body responds physically or how a person responds in different scenarios, and leveraging technology to be better understand that. I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that type of technology, but I guess it doesn't surprise me after seeing what all has evolved over the last many years here in the technology space. But yeah, that's super interesting. That was new to me for sure. There's a lot that we talked about in that conversation that I wasn't aware of and that was new to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think we could do like a crown. I think we could take it like up a level, for me at least. I'd like a brain sensing crown.
Right. Like in the
Right.
whole princess theme, like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Your kids,
Absolutely.
your daughter would love that too, I imagine.
Oh, she absolutely would. Yeah, she has a purse, and I don't carry a purse usually because I just have all kinds of stuff just spread around. I usually just have my wallet or the diaper bag, but she's gotten so into carrying her purse, and she hides all of her brother's stuff in it and hides it in her room. So she's diabolical. She's 18 months old, just to set the stage there.
They grow up so fast these days.
I know, right? Just, pilfering her brother's favorite things in her purse. So,
Right.
but I also thought it was great when Christina was talking about kind of that alignment of values. And that's what we kind of talked about in our hot topics, and seems to be a common theme within our 2022 content, is really we talked about the great reshuffling and those types of things. And in this employee centric market where, you really are kind of in a place where there's lots of opportunity, aligning with the values of the organization. And then she really touched on something, and I'd love to hear your feedback on it, is that the resistance to change or those barriers really exist in the individual. The leadership can create this culture. They can, really preach the message of, we're a culture of innovation, we're constantly changing, growing, etc. But unless we as individuals understand our own personal barriers to change, then we become resistors even unintentionally.
Yeah, yeah. It was a good reminder that there's so many different variables in managing change, the individual level, the organizational level, and even the broader cultural level. So I think we kind of alluded to those three layers, but that third layer of the individual, I mean, you think about an organization that has, say, 10,000 employees. That's 10,000 different personalities and 10,000 different reasons why an organization might and is likely to resist change. No matter how well intentioned the people are, and no matter how aligned they are with the vision of the organization or whatever the case may be, we're still human. We fear change. We're driven by fear and a certain amount of distrust and whatnot. So all that stuff does add up, and it creates that resistance, whether it's intentional or unintentional or otherwise.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about myself. I started much of my career in sales, and now that I'm on, more of the systems side of the industry and understanding that, I am a self-proclaimed resistor. I never did we'd get like a new system where we're supposed to be tracking like sales data. And I would be like, why would I have to do that? Because I'm selling the most. So obviously my process works just fine. So no need to do any of these things. And now I look back on it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I was the problem. I was the key to, the change resistance, and I didn't even know it because of my unwillingness as an individual to see that opportunity. And as an influencer, when you are kind of on the top of the pyramid and you don't do what the organization is essentially asking you to do, that trickles down to a lot of different areas as well. And I think that was really kind of an eye-opening piece of feedback for me, that a lot of times it does start with the individual, and that has to be an overall motivation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you bring up sales, or you talk about sales organizations that you've been involved with, and that's a common area of resistance within a lot of organizations, because when you're sales driven, you're focused on typically one thing, and that's selling. And entering data into a system is not selling. And or at least, if you're a salesperson, that's the mentality. It doesn't help me make more commission, doesn't help my pay, doesn't help. I'm not measured on it. So why am I going to support the change? So that's you really have, it's a good reminder that that's a reason why you need to understand what motivates people and what drives them, and why might they resist the change, even if they say they're on board with it, even if they're excited on the surface. Those are good examples of things that will undermine that excitement for any sort of change.
Absolutely. And then the last thing I'll touch on, because I don't know that we've ever really talked about this before, but when you have this concept of a new culture because of your new employees, and they bring a whole different aspect from just an age perspective a lot of times, or an experience perspective. And I think that's something that's definitely worth some awareness around, especially for organizations that are very intentional about their culture. They hire for culture, they have an aligned set of values, but then they also have to know that it is really free flowing depending on the individuals that are involved in your company culture. And that's kind of something that we've never really touched on before, but certainly an important dynamic that Christina touched on.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. I think that's a good point. I think that question originated from the audience, if I remember correctly. I think that was one of the audience questions that brought that up. So that was a really good point for sure.
But an excellent conversation, and I think we learn a lot from academia when we do study research, but it's interesting, of all of the professors and researchers we've had on ground control, all of them really point back to the importance of the people side, and the technology, though still important, is really almost a subcategory to the overall culture and people and processes of the business. So such a great interview. Thank you for taking the time to talk to her, and go Rams.
Yeah, right. And just to clarify, you're talking about the CSU Rams, right?
I
Colorado
am.
State
I am.
University.
I'm not talking about the LA Rams, but I am very excited that Russell Wilson is coming over to the good side, to the Broncos. So
Yes. Yeah. For those of you that aren't in the United States, the American football team of the city where Kyler and I are just recently acquired a big name quarterback in Russell Wilson. So good to have those sports references in here as well. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to bring on Scott Janke from the third stage team talking about organizational alignment and implementations. And I was going to say we're going to shift gears, but actually a lot of the same stuff we just talked about will also apply in this next conversation as well. So we'll come back, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you missed that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings. And the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. Our next segment will actually be with another professor who actually is on the third stage team as well, Dr. Scott Janke. He's a professor down in Dallas, and we've started going through some case study content development around some of our current and past clients. So I have this conversation with him just regarding one of our small to mid-sized clients that's involved in manufacturing. He talks about organizational alignment and the importance of having that established before technology implementation. So Scott, welcome to the show.
My name's Dr. Scott Janke. I actually am a senior manager at Third Stage, really going about the business of helping organizations either assess their processes and how they use their incumbent tools, or to assist them in looking at new opportunities for changes in ERP or another technology that would enable them to meet their business goals.
Excellent. And today we're actually talking about a case study, so a specific work that you've done with one of our clients within our community today. So can you give us kind of an overview of the reason why this client reached out to Third Stage?
Yeah, it's a familiar story, quite honestly. The organization feels like they were disconnected with their international offices. Silos of information were present. The incumbent technology really wasn't being used across the organization. And people were complaining about all the challenge they had with getting documents and information from another department, and really led us to kicking off the project with them to look at their technology and potentially advising them to maybe move into a new ERP implementation.
Excellent. And without revealing our client's name, can you give us kind of an overview of the size, industry, location, culture of this specific company?
Sure. They're a manufacturer in the Midwest. They have about 350 employees. They have offices in Europe and in Asia. And their business vertical is on the manufacturing side of laser or dot pen inscribing tools. So all the manufacturers out there that need to have some product identification, their systems are the ones that embed those numbers on those applications or products. So Harley-Davidson is a client of theirs, and
Cool.
the serial number you see on their frame is using their technology.
Excellent. Very neat. Very interesting company, it sounds like, to work with. So how did Third Stage come in and help them kind of solve this problem of just overall technology optimization, it sounds like.
Sure. I think most clients that engage third stage probably have an idea of where the project's going to lead them. But we start from a more holistic, independent perspective in that we don't want to be geared or directed in our assessment. We want to look at it from a 30,000 down to a 300-foot level, where we look at technology, the obstacles around that, processes, but also the human aspect of the organization. And rather interesting findings when we performed our organizational readiness assessment that really highlighted the fact that simply changing technology was not the direction we needed to go.
Interesting. So what were the results of the project? You know, what did you end up recommending to them after you did all of these assessments and kind of got your hands dirty within the organization, got to know them really well?
Yeah, and you know, they're probably very similar to a number of small to medium companies that want to be bigger, is that they have grown organically, but also through acquisitions and sister companies that become part of the main organization. Is that they had systems of independence, so to speak. So the folks in Europe had their own system, the folks in Asia had their own systems, the United States. And really the linchpin of our recommendation was, as I mentioned earlier, the ORA survey, is that there was a significant amount of obstacles and perceptions that any future change without fixing the foundation was going to be fraught with errors and problems. So our recommendation wasn't necessarily just go out and buy a new system and deploy it company-wide. Is to really look at the basic, or what I call blocking and tackling. So data was all over the place. There wasn't any kind of structure or management around that. We actually recommended that they dispose of certain systems and bring those organizations or their departments onto the main platform. So there's a lot of things that organizations would do prior to implementing and selecting and implementing an ERP system. And we actually advise them as our output of this project to do just that. Get the environment and the organization set up for success for maybe a future ERP selection implementation. So getting systems integrated with each other, training people, that was also another big highlight of our organizational assessment survey, is that people just didn't believe they were well trained with the last implementation. So actually kind of going back a few steps and looking at this from what are the simple, quick wins that we can do in an organization that you would need to do anyway prior to a major ERP implementation. And I would say that the leadership was surprised by those findings, but really once we went through the justification for that, and that every item that we recommended were activities they would have to do anyway, we just wanted to put the pause on them spending any significant amount of money that would just introduce more errors and problems into their organization.
So it sounds like you recommended that they needed to get their organization aligned around whether it's business processes, whether it's their optimization of their own technology, training, integration, data management, those types of things. So when you do that type of recommendation, do you give the client steps to make sure that they are establishing that strong foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of our projects, maybe not all, but most of our projects do include some form of roadmap that when we provide our recommendations, and I've been on the side of running operations myself, and I've never liked it when people gave advice, but didn't tell you how to implement that advice. So we do advise kind of stages of, let's say, what you can do immediately, what you can do within 1 to 3 months, what you can do in the next 12 months, and then maybe the next year. So organizations cannot stop doing their business. And so giving them a direction, a roadmap is so important, because without leadership and guidance around that, too many companies would probably start in the process of improving themselves in 3 or 4 months and then stop. So this gave them a little kind of cookie crumb kind of process that they could follow for literally the next 12 months and have great success because they're achievable objectives.
Excellent. So you kind of gave them a game plan, a playbook, if you will, to kind of lay out what the next steps are to achieve that optimization within their organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so can you just enlighten us to third stage is a technology agnostic and independent consultancy. So what does that mean for a client that may engage you to say, hey, I think I need new ERP software, and then you come out on the other end being like, actually, the organization needs some restructuring and just some tightening up before we can do that. Do you care if they buy software or not?
Good question. We don't have a financial relationship with software vendors out there. We have relationships with the vendors because we have selected ERP systems and other point solutions. We've implemented them. So we know what I would think would be the best fit for organizations. And I think that agnostic perspective allows us to actually make a recommendation of don't buy more software. And I think that just gains more credibility for our reputation, but also our clients are realizing that when they do client reference calls, we are going to give you the truth, and we will give you a direction that doesn't necessarily have some kind of financial impact to us. And so if our recommendation is buy software, buy this software, or don't buy software at all, I think that gives us that agnostic perspective that I think most consulting firms don't have.
Very interesting. Well said. Thank you for taking us through that process. So with this specific client, what were some key challenges that you ran into when working on their specific scope of work?
Yeah, I think, and this is kind of in line with kind of what I think most companies have experienced over the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic. Is that their sales took a significant hit. And so the pressure to improve the performance of the organization was pretty relevant and matter of fact in all the workshops that we had, that the organization was kind of stressing potentially too much of what they can do with their current system to trying to get back those sales. So, and I don't want to be a seller of the ORA survey too much, but that was really enlightening because we heard grumblings, we heard perspectives from the workforce in our workshops and some of our one-on-one interviews, but it was really the survey that highlighted some significant obstacles for any significant change going forward. So one of the things that we tried to adopt is allowing the folks in the workforce who will be part of any implementation to be part of the solution. So we identified easy wins, hard wins throughout the evaluation, and really educating our sponsor about what we're finding, but still keeping even our agnostic view of who's saying what at arm's reach so that people could have a voice in the decision making. So almost going to what we do in a RFP ERP selection is that we allow the decision making to be a collective perspective for all parties. So this isn't our recommendations, it's what we heard from the team based with our experience becomes the recommendations out of a project like this.
Excellent. And when you are going through this kind of cultural survey, if you will, or the readiness assessment, when you conduct them, it seems like kind of a vulnerable or sensitive process that can make employees sometimes uncomfortable and hold them back from being completely honest. How do you make sure that there is autonomy within that process?
Yeah, we walk through how this process works. So outside of some maybe identification questions like what department do you work in, how long have you been with the company, that's the closest personal information we collect. Our tool does not collect email addresses, even IP addresses to some extent. So it is really agnostic. I don't know who fills out anything. And quite honestly, probably the folks that have the most uneasiness is actually some of the leadership that we work with, because we ask the workforce how leadership performs. Do they give you encouragement and workable goals? Do they support change? Do they allow further training for system implementation? So we actually kind of put all the leadership on the questionnaire from a perspective of how does the workforce view them before we make any kind of recommendation for a significant change in the organization. So it's probably less of the individuals who fill out the surveys and more about does the leadership really want to know the answers to these questions?
Right. That's a really interesting perspective. So do you feel like they did want to know the answer to the questions?
Quite honestly, and I think basing all the findings that we collect in a project like this, the survey, workshops, one-on-one interviews, looking at company documentation that they provide us, when we embed them all together and link them, I think the findings help support our recommendations. So going back to your question about, how is third stage agnostic and how do we view software purchases? Well, for us to recommend changes that really won't be successful based upon our findings would be very short-sighted on our part. Obviously, we want to be part of any future project with our clients, but quite honestly, we need to be realistic in our expectations in our recommendations. So for them to go off and go do this magical project that will solve all their problems, even though we know that won't be true based upon our findings, that's not good for our long-term longevity either. So I think the leadership want to know reality so that they know what they're getting into. Again, having been on that side of the fence, I never wanted to have a consulting firm or software integration firm sell me a bag of goods that they potentially are going to know that it's not fruitful for us to pursue.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a pretty typical exercise that a lot of leadership teams go through within this process. It's just kind of an overall awareness of where their business is at. And technology, as we know, is never a solution. It should be, an optimization tool for an already strong and healthy, thriving culture. So what were some key milestones that you and your team achieved during this project?
Milestone in the sense of phases that we did or some of the deliverables that we produced?
I would say milestones could be however you interpret it, not to, answer a question with a question, but what were some of the key points that you feel like you were actually making an impact on the business?
So great question. And I think going back to, how do employees feel about a project like this? More than anything, we stress that we're not out there looking to see what they're doing in their job. So could the organization do without their services? This is about most organizations wanting to grow without necessarily hiring a ton of folks. So when we level set with the folks that we talk to, they start understanding that we're here to help. But more importantly, we're probably asking questions that the leadership probably never had time to do as well. So as we go through workshops, the survey, we actually did a technology review of solutions out there just to see whether there would be a better fit, and providing that feedback, not again, just to the leadership, but to the departments as well. So I think the engagement that we provide along the way, we kind of allow them to be, again, part of the solution making. So between the survey, the workshops, our analysis of other ERP solutions out there, really gain the traction from the folks there. So along the way, whether you call them milestones or stage gates along the process, we allowed them to kind of level set every time we kind of paused in the project. And so I think it allowed them to change direction if they wanted to, or ask greater clarification about some of our findings without just waiting to the end. So we have a very strict methodology in gaining leadership buy-in along the way. And so those milestones or phases of a project allow us to kind of stop, pause, understand what's going on before we get too far down the road. So that when we give our recommendations at the end, they're not surprised, they're not challenged with it because we've kind of given them the education along the way.
Excellent. And do you know how this company is doing now? Now that
I do actually. It's they're actually sales are increasing. They've made some of the changes that we recommended. Obviously, my phone is ready for any kind of call from the leadership to come help them, because again, it's very challenging for projects to take place of any significance while the operations is doing what they're doing day to day. And so we don't expect, and I never expect, that a client's going to go off and do their own project by themselves. I highly encourage it. Knowledge retention is great, so I encourage all organizations to try, but really they need to come help and allow us to assist them in that process. So they have made some of the blocking and tackling, so to speak, changes, but it's just kind of, it's not a one and done kind of activity.
Sure.
This is an evolution for organizations. So I'm hoping that we'll get a repeat or at least an opportunity to come back and assist them along this journey. But they are, sales are up. They've made some changes. They've seen some results from that. It's just keeping the pace of what they need to grow.
Yeah, well, it sounds like those recommendations have made a positive impact as they continue to evolve within their overall strategies. So what did you specifically learn from this project, if anything?
That's as much as I think processes can dictate success, or technology can dictate success, or having clear objectives will drive success. It's really comes down to the people. As long as there are humans within our organizations, their attitudes, skill sets, training, workload, all that come into play of making anything successful. Too often you will see demonstrations of ERP systems that are fabulous, right? Newest technology, it's great.
Yeah.
But then we want everyone to do their job, plus implement a system, plus learn new systems, plus change, and they have work-life balance as well. We can never forget the individual in any of our decision making, because they're going to be the success factor or not. And so I keep learning that the individual is a very strong component to making any of our projects successful. And I think this project didn't necessarily give me insight to that for the first time. It just keeps reiterating the strength that the individual has in success.
Sure, reinforcing that organizational change management and need for those types of initiatives and strategies, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for talking to me today, Scott. And if anyone has any questions for Scott about this specific project or anything in the manufacturing or digital transformation space, please feel free to reach out to him directly. His contact information is on the Contact Us section of our website. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining me today and taking us through this really interesting case study. I'm going to unpack it with Eric when we come right back. This is Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come. Relax.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. Eric, I think this is the first time you've heard our case study with Scott. So I wanted to get, some of your feedback. Obviously, Scott is a professor. He's very articulate. He's very good at understanding all of the nuances needed, specifically on the organizational side. But he referenced a lot of organizational kind of issues within just having clients that might have kind of a disassembled digital transformation team. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a common theme where you do have to come in, strategize, saying, this stakeholder should be involved, this stakeholder, it's not time yet, but feedback is still important, and how you go about doing that.
Yeah, it's definitely more art than science, but you do want to make sure you have all the key stakeholders involved and all the the key parts of the business represented in the overall transformation, and ultimately that you want to make sure that your organization is taking ownership of the project, because it's easy to really sort of delegate to the experts. And I think we touched on that in the conversation with Christina a bit too, earlier in the show, about that sort of disconnect that you sometimes see between the novices and the experts. And you may view yourselves as a novice if you're a company that's going to go through a transformation, because you don't know as much about technology or digital transformation perhaps. but you really are the experts in your business, your industry, what it is you're trying to become. And so you need to marry those two sets of expertise in order to be successful. And that requires, involving some of the key stakeholders throughout the business. So it just depends on what the scope of the transformation is. You want to make sure you involve people that are going to be affected by the scope of the transformation.
Yeah, and with that, make sure that there is alignment on all of those tiers, which Scott kind of talks about the need for that executive alignment, but also the project team alignment around those strategic goals and objectives for any transformation to be successful. One other thing that I'll just mention from this conversation that we don't talk a lot about on transformation ground control, but where third stage really comes in is building those demo scripts for the vendors. So we talk sometimes about, how to make sure you're getting the most out of your demos. But what third stage does is they come and they understand the business goals, not from the vendor side what they want you to buy. And I think, we talk a lot in these case studies about how that integration from our actual team that handles and executes the projects and how they do that. And I think that's something that they point out here that's really interesting is a lot of times vendors will want to show you their latest and greatest, most sparkly version when really the business is looking for certain functionalities or at least looking to understand how it would integrate with their business. And that's really where an independent third party comes into play. And I thought that was, well said there.
Yeah, and really just driving with and leading with the business need first rather than the technology. And I think that's a subtle but really important mindset or mind shift. I don't know, whatever. Changing your mindset that's a really important part of that.
Absolutely. And if you do have questions for Scott or want to reach out to him, we'll put his contact information below. You can also reach out to me, and I'm happy to put you in touch with whomever. We will have all of these case studies available on our YouTube channel. We do one for each industry. This was manufacturing. And then we do one for each one of our services. This was implementation. We have another one up there, for example, that talks about a software selection and really digs into what are those demos, what do those scripts look like with some of our other team members. So if you'd like to check those out, head over to the Third Stage YouTube channel.
Yeah, great. And that's a good resource for anyone that wants to check that out. And you can also, speaking of our YouTube channel, be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. If you just look for Third Stage Consulting on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to us there. We put out new videos weekly. And you can also follow me on YouTube and my YouTube channel as well. On an individual level, we put out similar but different content, all related to digital transformation. And you can also find us on all the social media platforms as well. So if you're on Instagram or LinkedIn, TikTok, whatever the case may be, Twitter, be sure to check us out and subscribe and follow us. And we put out content daily on all those platforms. So good conversations here today. Thank you to our guests, Scott Janke and Christina Serrano. Of course, thank you to you, Kyler, for being part of the show as always. And thanks to our audience for all the great questions and feedback that you've provided on here as well. So we will see you next week. We have new episodes every Wednesday of this show. You'll find a new episode of ours next Wednesday as well. So be sure to check that out. And in the meantime, have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Transformation Ground Control.